Okay, so I have talked about early warning systems on many occasions, and I'm a big fan of them because they are not just about saving lives, but this is also actually one of the best adaptation tools. Adaptation to climate change impacts comes down to multiple time scales. The short day-to-day, season-to-season crisis management is an important thing, and then you need decadal strategies, policies, resilience building, and so on. And you want to have an eye on the horizon to see where things are headed in terms of temperature, precipitation, humidity, health, energy requirements, energy sources, and so on and so forth. So this is a nice report by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Early Warnings for All, which we'll read a little bit about, and of course the World Meteorological Organization, which tracks the status of early warning systems. This is global status of multi-hazard early warning systems 2023. I will update every year if possible on what new things are being done, but here we'll just go through these to look at some of the foundational efforts and the principles and recommendations and so on. So obviously it's a big report and I'm going to be very brief again, even though it'll be a few podcasts. Executive summary: the impact of disasters continues to increase at a rapid rate, fueled by climate emergency. You have to be careful about these words, but nonetheless, climate crisis, climate emergency, and all these sorts of words are used. Not always. Anyway, multi-hazard early warning systems, MHEWS, or we can call them MUSE, are a proven measure to reduce disaster risk and adapt to a changing climate. As a result, they can save lives while averting and minimizing losses and damages. MHEWS MUSE provide a tenfold return on investment, and this report further highlights that countries with low MUSE coverage have nearly a 6 times higher disaster mortality rate and 5 times more disaster affected people when compared with countries with high MUSE coverage. So I'm going to just use MUSE, MHEWS, multi-hazard early warning systems. So just get used to it, because I don't want to keep saying MHEWS every time. Just say MUSE, right? What is the challenge? Only half of the world, so 52%, is covered by an early warning system. This translates to 101 countries, which is an increase of 6 countries from last year. So progress is being made, but if you look at least low-income countries and least developed countries and small island developing states and so on, that's where the numbers are low, and they are generally also highly vulnerable. So you want to focus on those sorts of things. Early warning systems exist. Even where early warning systems exist, uneven progress is seen across the MUSE pillars. So what are the pillars? Disaster risk knowledge, observations and forecasting, dissemination and communication, and preparedness to respond. Just having early warnings is not very useful unless you have prepared the system to respond to these early warnings, and the system has monitoring, observations, networks for forecasting, getting it from somewhere or producing it yourselves, and have a network for dissemination and communication of the early warnings as well. Then there is the vulnerability part, where people receiving it must be able to interpret and act on the early warnings. The increasing unpredictability, complexity, and severity of hazardous events are challenging the MUSE capability. Limited risk knowledge as the first MUSE pillar hampers early warnings effectiveness, which is further aggravated by gaps in global basic observation network GBON across much of the African continent and parts of the Pacific and Latin America. So essentially, main thing to remember is that the entire system, the globe, is only as resilient and as vulnerable as the most vulnerable and the least resilient country. So weather hazard, climate impacts in one place affect the entire world now. So typhoon that hits Taiwan or Philippines can cascade into the global network of global markets and connected economies in many ways that we don't even know or can't even anticipate every time. Okay, so despite advances in technology, especially connectivity, some communities remain hard to reach and support. So obviously intensive actions are needed. As you can see, I'm skipping a lot of the text and reading just the highlighted parts because this is a nice report. If you're interested in it, you must go back and read it. It's available online, but I'm going to be brief because I just want to expose the most salient points, and that's a subjective choice, so you want to follow up. So what are the progress and highlights that the report includes? Several initiatives on Muse are underway to scale up early warning coverage and close the early warning, early action gap. Advances in science and technology, together with the increase in the availability of observational data, have led to improvements in forecasts, especially at longer lead times. So the implementation of the Common Alerting Protocol, CAP, Common Alerting Protocol, has helped the timely flow of information from authoritative sources to the public across multiple channels. By the way, this report has some 3 pages of acronyms, so I'm going to run into trouble with the acronyms, but I will look them up as we get stuck. Okay, the report highlights the need for an overall risk governance approach to Muse. So, the need for an overall risk governance approach. It's not just, you need hyper-local information on risks, vulnerability, exposure, hazards, but you also want to have a global map so that you know how the economies are going to be vulnerable on the whole, how the supply chains may be affected by impacts in one place, or how high risk in one place needs to be dealt with to protect everybody, and so on and so forth. So an incredibly connected global system now. Increasing international cooperation in Muse is enabling countries with lower capacity to generate reliable forecasts, which they can then tailor to reflect local context and local needs. So many countries like India offer help and forecasts and training for neighboring countries, and this is very useful because India itself will be vulnerable if the countries around are impacted. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, anything that happens in the neighborhood, Sri Lanka, that's going to be the vulnerability of India also. Let's look at outlook and opportunities. This is all executive summary. We'll add some details as we go along. The launch of the early warning systems for all, EW for all initiative, with its vision to protect every human on earth, is an early warning system that has accelerated the momentum on Muse. To realize this ambitious vision, there is a clear need to scale up the level of investments in Muse. So what do we mean by that? World Bank may help developing countries, or developing countries like India may help their neighbors, and of course rich countries are supposed to do more on loss and damage, climate finance, and so on, but that's a long and different discussion. The data ecosystem underlying Muse should be strengthened and expanded. While strengthening the technological base for Muse is important, no-tech and low-tech solutions can also be considered, because you don't always have the finance or the even energy needed, power, electricity, and so on, to install some of the high-tech instruments and technological infrastructure. But if you can manage with no tech and low tech, then lives can still be saved. The ever increasing magnitude and impact of the climate emergency calls for greatly upscaling adaptation and disaster risk reduction efforts. A lot of this we'll look at in terms of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and there are lots of case studies in the report of countries that are doing well and countries that need to do much better, and so I won't go into all those sorts of details. Okay, so let's leave this executive summary podcast here, and we'll come back and look at each chapter and make a few points from each chapter. But again, this is on the kind of a status report on multi-hazard early warning systems, or what I will call MUSE throughout, and it's from UNDRR and Early Warnings for All and WMO. It's a annual report, but I'm using the one from the most recent one to set the base, and if in the coming years I find some new exciting developments, I will add supplemental material to these podcasts, which is easy enough to do, and reflect it on YouTube. The report is very good, lots of details, lots of case studies, lots of references, and you want to read the report if you are interested. I'm being brief, but I do use it for various other articles I write or talks I give, and the advice I give to the government agencies that ask for it, and so on. So very useful. We'll come back and continue. This should be 3 or 4 podcasts at least. So see you in the next podcast on the progress on MUSE.